A blizzard, a cabin deep in the woods, and a baby girl, barely a few weeks old, left in a basket at the doorstep of a man who hadn't spoken to another soul in years. She wasn't alone. A wounded German shepherd stood guard beside her, eyes hollow but fierce. What happened next wasn't in any rescue manual, and it sure wasn't part of Walter's quiet plan for dying. Stay with us. This story may just change how you see second chances. Like, comment, and subscribe if you believe that love can still find us, even at the end of the road. Late winter had turned the hills of western Montana into a canvas of silence. Snow blanketed the winding forest roads, softening the outlines of pine and birch, and the wind carried a stillness that could only be found after a storm. The night before, a blizzard had swept through the region, hammering the ridges and settling thick drifts along the trails that led into the upper forest. The nearest town, Everbrook, population barely 2,000, lay 10 miles away, where smoke curled lazily from chimneys and tire tracks vanished into nothing after the highway ended. But deeper into the trees, far beyond the reach of salt trucks or cell towers, sat a solitary cabin crouched against the shoulder of a hill, wooden and worn, its porch dusted in knee-high snow. The man who lived inside was named Walter Bishop, 72 years old, 6'1", broad-shouldered despite age, with skin like weathered bark and hands knotted by decades of labor. A retired Army medic who had once treated soldiers in the worst corners of the world, Walter now lived alone, his only company the radio static and the occasional elk straying too close to the shed. His hair was steel gray, cut short out of habit, and his eyes sharp and pale rarely missed movement in the woods. People in town whispered of a man who spoke little, bought canned beans in bulk, and drove his truck only once a month for propane. But they didn't know the photo tucked inside his dresser drawer. A younger Walter, standing beside a woman with auburn hair and a girl with braces, both now gone. After the accident 6 years ago, the cabin had become a kind of exile and refuge, equal parts shelter and sentence. That morning, just after sunrise, Walter stepped onto his porch to check the roof for ice damage. The cold bit hard at his jaw. A brittle sky stretched wide above him, tinted soft lavender. Snowflakes still drifted in lazy spirals, the tail end of the storm reluctant to leave. Walter scanned the clearing, one hand on his thermos, when something moved in the distance. It wasn't an elk, it wasn't a fox, it was lower, heavier, swaying oddly with each step. He narrowed his eyes. A large dog-no, a German shepherd, was lumbering toward him through the snow. Its coat was black and tan, dusted white from head to tail. The dog's gait was uneven. It limped visibly on its right hind leg. Around its powerful neck hung a shredded rope, and clutched firmly in its jaws was a woven basket, draped with something knitted in red. Walter's hand hesitated at the sight of the cloth. He recognized the stitching, slightly uneven, the work of a hand unpracticed but determined. He had seen it before. Almost a year ago, on a spring night washed in rain, a young woman had knocked on the door of this cabin. No baby. Just a mud-smeared backpack, a thin-soaked coat, and eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. She stood hunched beneath the porch awning, one hand gripping the leash of a German shepherd, the other clutching her bag like someone waiting for it to be taken from her. She had been pale, underweight, but didn't beg, just asked, "Can I stay the night?" Her voice was hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken aloud in days. When Walter opened the door, she'd flinched not from fear of him, but as if she was used to fists instead of greetings. Her left forearm bore a bruise, both old and new, trailing beneath her sleeve. He pretended not to notice. The dog never took its eyes off him, watching, ready. He had let her in, gave her soup, a dry cot. And before she left at dawn, he had handed her one of his late wife's old blankets, red, hand-knit, warm like a memory offered to someone drowning. "If you're ever in trouble again," he'd said as she stepped out into the fog, "this place will still be here." He had almost forgotten, but she hadn't. The dog stopped 10 feet from the porch, panting, its dark eyes locked on Walter's. The basket shook slightly with each heave of breath. Walter approached slowly, knelt, and gently pulled back the red knit cloth. A baby girl. Newborn, maybe 3 or 4 days old. Her skin was pale blue with cold, lips parted but barely moving. A faint, fragile breath pulsed beneath her layers. She was swaddled tightly, almost too tightly, as if someone had tried to hold warmth in with fear alone. At the bottom of the basket, an old heating pad had long gone cold. Walter didn't think. He acted. Inside the cabin, the stove had burned low, but coals still glowed. He added logs, opened the vent wide, and stripped off his coat. He laid the child on a flannel blanket near the fire and went to work. His hands moved with instinct born of decades under pressure. He checked her pulse at the wrist, counted her respirations, felt her limbs for stiffness. He rubbed her hands and feet, gently but firmly. Her skin was cold, but not yet frozen. He poured warm, not hot water into a glass bottle and placed it beneath the blanket by her feet. A basin was filled, formula measured, a tiny rubber dropper retrieved from the cabinet. His late wife had once fostered kittens. He remembered how. The child whimpered. It was a sound so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone but a medic. It meant her brain still had fight. Walter held the dropper to her lips, a few drops in, then more. When she swallowed, he nearly wept. He didn't sit down until she had color in her cheeks again, until her breath slowed, deeper, steadier. Only then did he notice the dog silent, the entire time still lying by the door, eyes half closed but alert. Its side rose and fell quickly, from fatigue or pain, he couldn't tell. There was blood, dried and dark, around its right hind leg. Walter fetched a bowl of water and placed it nearby. The dog didn't move. He approached slowly, knelt, and examined the leg. A torn pad, minor lacerations. Painful, but not critical. "You're one hell of a soldier," he murmured. His voice softened, not unlike the tone he had once used over wounded bodies in field hospitals. "Got your girl here safe, took a hit and kept going." He cleaned the wounds with warm saline, wrapped them with gauze, and spoke in low rhythms, not expecting comprehension, but offering solidarity. The dog didn't flinch. It didn't even whimper. That night, as snow settled like ash on the branches outside, the cabin held 3 lives suspended in new gravity. An old man exiled from grief, a child returned from the edge of cold, and a dog who had crossed the wilderness with a mission no one had assigned. The child slept near the fire. The dog lay watchful, unmoving, a shadow made flesh. Walter didn't know where they had come from exactly, or how far they'd traveled. He only knew this. Something had brought them here. And whatever that something was, it had remembered the way. The morning after the storm arrived, quiet but bitter. Pale sunlight filtered through frost-streaked windows, casting thin ribbons of gold across the cabin floor. Outside, the wind had died down, but the world remained wrapped in white. The child was still asleep near the stove, her breath steady now, her fists curled beneath her chin. Walter had refueled the fire 3 times in the night, unwilling to let the warmth falter even for a minute. Before leaving that morning, he'd placed extra firewood beside the stove and wrapped the child in another layer of wool, just in case. On the far side of the hearth, the dog ranger lay, in a sphinx-like pose, awake and silent, his ears flicking at the faintest creak of the cabin walls. Walter sipped lukewarm coffee and watched the dog. They hadn't spoken, of course, not in any real way, but there was something quietly understood between them. A rhythm. A trust forming in the unspoken moments. Ranger didn't whine. He didn't beg for food. He only kept his eyes fixed on the child, glancing toward the door once or twice like a soldier waiting for the next order that might never come. By noon, the solar battery-powered radio was still dead. No signal, no weather updates, no chatter from town. Walter tested the landline too, but the static told him what he already suspected. The storm had taken out the local lines and tucked this deep in the forest. It could be days, maybe a week or more, before anyone in Everbrook even realized a child was missing. He looked over at the basket and the child wrapped within it. He couldn't wait for the world to catch up. So he packed a thermos, his parka, and a flashlight. Left a folded blanket beside the baby. Then he knelt beside Ranger. "You want to come?" he asked softly. The dog rose without hesitation. The forest outside was hushed and blindingly bright. The trees shimmered with frost, and every branch bore the memory of the storm. Walter stepped off the porch, boots sinking into the snow. Behind him, Ranger followed with a limp but no paws, nose low, tail still. Walter moved toward the edge of the trail, eyes scanning for prints something, anything. He found them beneath the crust, a jagged, uneven line of the paw prints, wide and deep from carrying weight. Then smaller indentations, 2 human shoes, thin-soled. They angled downhill, away from the cabin, back toward the world. Walter followed them. The path curved through the trees like a forgotten memory. Occasionally, Ranger would pause, nose twitching, tail rigid, and then move on. But once just past a broken cedar, Ranger hesitated, ears shifting. Then, slowly, he veered left, as if retracing a memory etched deeper than instinct. They passed a split birch where the snow was stained faintly pink, and again near a bent bush clinging to a torn scrap of fabric. Navy blue, synthetic, likely pocket lining. Walter didn't touch it. Ranger sniffed the air, then pressed forward with new urgency. By the time they reached the clearing near the base of the hill, Walter could see the edge of old familiarity, an abandoned gas station converted into a general store, long shuttered in winter. It sat slumped beside a gravel road that hadn't been plowed in weeks. The windows were taped from the inside, and a rusted ice machine out front wore a snowcap 2 feet deep. Walter remembered the place. A woman named Lorna had once run it, tough as elk hide, always wore overalls and smelled like cinnamon. It had closed last fall. But something about this spot tugged at a memory. That night, nearly a year ago, the girl had come soaked, clutching a worn backpack. He hadn't looked inside, but he remembered something odd peeking out from the zipper was a tiny corner of fabric, purple maybe. Could have been a baby sock, could have been a bottle, and now... He looked at the wrapper in the snow. Cough syrup, same color, same shape, and that patch of darker snow nearby. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. Ranger stepped closer to the stain, then stopped, laid down slowly. His ears drooped slightly, not in fear, but in something heavier, resignation, or grief. Walter crouched beside the spot and studied it. The snow was clumped irregularly, disturbed by small hands and paws. But one detail stood out, a faint outline of fingers trailing through the snow, leading away from the puddle and ending abruptly. She had been here, and not just briefly. Perhaps she had collapsed here. Perhaps the blood was hers, not from some minor scratch, but from something deeper. Maybe she had passed out from cold, or hunger, or something worse. Maybe she had known she wouldn't be able to take another step, and maybe, just maybe, this is where she told Ranger to go. Walter felt the weight of it settle over him, the storm, the distance, the bleeding. There hadn't been a choice. She hadn't walked away from her child. She had sent her forward, through teeth and wind and snow, the only way left. Walter poured warm broth into a collapsible bowl and set it down for Ranger. The dog drank quietly, then resumed his watch. They stayed there for over an hour, not because there was more to find, but because neither of them seemed quite ready to leave. As shadows began to stretch across the snow, Walter rose. He took one last look around, then turned toward home. They moved slower on the return. The wind was picking up again, and the temperature had started to dip. When they reached the cabin, the sky had dimmed to a slate gray, and the first whisper of flurries returned. Inside, the fire had dulled, but not died. The child stirred in the basket, her eyelids fluttering. Walter stripped off his coat, added 2 logs to the stove, and rubbed warmth back into his hands before kneeling beside her. He checked her temperature, found her pulse steady, and for the first time, she opened her eyes. They were dark. Deep brown, almost black in the firelight. She blinked, looked past him, and fixed her gaze on Ranger, who had taken up his position once more by the hearth. Walter said nothing. He didn't reach for her, just watched her watching the dog. Ranger didn't move, but his tail thudded once against the wooden floor. Later that night, Walter found himself unable to sleep. He sat with a notebook in his lap, one of the many his wife had once kept for recipes and planting notes. On the first blank page, he wrote only one line. If she survives this winter, she'll need a name. But he didn't write it yet. As he set the notebook aside, his gaze drifted toward the basket. Just beneath the fold of the red blanket, tucked into the side pocket, was a small dented tin box. He hadn't touched it. Not yet. Still too soon to open that little tin box, but not forever. He leaned back in the chair. Outside, snowflakes fell again, whispering secrets against the glass. Ranger sighed softly in his sleep. The baby's breathing was even. The world, for now, had gone quiet again. The snowfall overnight had been light but steady, smoothing the old tracks, dusting pine boughs with fresh powder, and draping the forest in silence once more. The next morning dawned gray and flat, the kind of cold that didn't bite but settled slow, insistent into everything, like sorrow. Walter stirred embers into flame and reheated what remained of the broth. The child was still asleep, her body curved inward like a comma beneath the heavy layers. Ranger sat upright by the door, ears forward, head tilted slightly toward the woods. He hadn't moved from that spot since sunrise, as if he'd been waiting for Walter to understand something unspoken. Walter watched him. There was a shift in the dog's posture, something between alert and restless. A pressure. And Walter, who had lived too long with grief to ignore what it tried to whisper, finally pulled on his coat and gloves. They left just before noon, heading north this time, away from the road, deeper into the woods. There was no trail here, only Ranger's lead. The dog moved with renewed certainty, weaving through thickets, hopping over frozen logs. Every so often he paused to sniff the air, then continued. His limp was present but not slowing him, not today. Walter kept pace, boots crunching softly over the crusted snow, heart heavier with each step. He didn't ask what they were looking for. He already knew. They crossed a narrow ravine where a dry creek bed had frozen mid-trickle, brittle icicles clinging to exposed roots. Up ahead, a fallen cedar split the path, its trunk hollowed by time. Ranger stopped there. He sniffed once, then continued, more cautiously now. Around a cluster of boulders, the trees opened slightly, revealing a shallow depression where snow had drifted deeper than elsewhere. And at its center, nearly buried, was a shape. Walter stopped. Even from a distance, he recognized what it was. She lay curled on her side beneath a skeletal pine, her back arched slightly as if trying to shield herself from the wind. Her coat was thin cotton, too light for winter and dusted with ice. Snow had gathered in her hair, a soft brown now threaded with silver frost. One arm was beneath her, the other curved protectively toward where something had once rested. A basket, perhaps. Or a child. Walter approached slowly, kneeling beside her. Her face was pale, mouth parted slightly. There was no fear in her expression, only exhaustion. The peace of someone who had given everything they had to give. Her backpack lay nearby, one strap torn. He opened it carefully. Inside were a few crumpled diapers, a bottle, 2 granola bars, and at the bottom, a folded piece of paper, edges wilted, the ink smeared but still legible. If I don't make it, her name is Amelia Grace. She's the best thing I've ever done. Please help her. Please. The last words had run off the page in a jagged line, as if her hand had failed her just before the end. Beside the note was a Polaroid photograph. It showed the woman smiling faintly, holding a newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket. Her eyes, though tired, were luminous with pride. Beside her sat Ranger, younger then, his black and tan coat gleaming, a soft purple ribbon looped awkwardly around his collar. The photo was creased, but the love in it had survived. Tucked into the same compartment was a small knitted lamb, toy handmade, unevenly stitched, the kind of thing only a mother would keep. One of its ears had nearly unraveled. Walter sat back on his heels. The forest around him was impossibly still. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. He didn't cry, but something inside him loosened. He dug a shallow grave beneath the pine, where the roots curled gently like arms. It took time, more than an hour, but he worked in silence, his breath fogging in the air, his movement steady and reverent. When it was done, he placed the blanket from her pack around her shoulders before covering her. He laid the photo and the lamb atop the final layer of snow. Ranger stood beside him the entire time, unmoving, ears flattened slightly, eyes locked on the woman who had once been his world. When Walter stepped back, the dog stepped forward, sniffed the edge of the mound, then lay down beside it, chin on paws, and did not move for a long time. Walter waited. Eventually, Ranger rose. They began the long walk home. By the time they returned, the sky had deepened into dusk. The cabin glowed faintly through the trees, the firelight spilling through the windows like a beacon. Inside, the child stirred in her basket. Walter knelt beside her, gently adjusting the blanket. Her fingers wrapped around the corner of the red knit, eyes fluttering open just long enough to catch the light. Walter didn't speak, but he did, for the first time, allow himself to look directly at the little tin box still tucked beside her. He didn't open it, not yet. He only whispered, "She had a name," and turned toward the stove to boil more water. That night, Walter dreamt of pine trees and lavender skies, of a tired young woman offering a baby into the arms of a dog and whispering, "Go," of frost clinging to lashes and warmth rising again in unexpected places. The forest was still outside, but the silence no longer felt like grief. 2 days passed after the burial in the woods. The weather remained sullen and unmoving, a low ceiling of clouds pressing down over the pines. Walter went about his days with quiet ritual, tending the stove, boiling water, feeding the child small amounts with the rubber dropper, stitching up the blanket where the corner had frayed. Ranger, never far, paced in short semicircles near the door, his ears flicking at every gust of wind, as though waiting for something neither of them wanted to name. On the third morning, the temperature rose just enough to let the snow start to melt in patches. Walter noticed water beads forming along the windowsills, the sound of dripping from the edge of the tin roof. He also noticed something else, an unease in Ranger that wasn't about weather. The dog had taken to sitting with his nose pressed near the base of the door, body rigid, tail flat. Something had shifted. 17 miles away, down the mountain, a man had arrived in Everbrook. His name was Cole Harper. He wore a black windbreaker with fraying seams and a pair of old steel-toe boots caked in road salt. His hair, once blonde, had dulled to a color between rust and ash. He was lean, but carried himself like a much bigger man, his shoulders squared with practiced menace. At the town diner, he sat at the counter nursing bad coffee, asking quiet questions to the waitress, a girl with a nose ring and tired hands, about a woman and a baby. Said he was looking for his niece. Said she might be traveling with a dog. He showed no photo. Later that day, Cole stopped by Duncan's Pharmacy, a family-run place wedged between the feed store and the hardware shop. Duncan himself was not there. His daughter Miranda was. Early 40s, broad-shouldered and steady-eyed, she had run the counter for 10 years. She didn't like strangers who lingered, Cole asked again. A young woman, traveling alone, maybe with a German shepherd. Miranda frowned, said she hadn't seen anyone like that recently. He asked if she had a log of deliveries, just out of curiosity. Something about medication for infants. She told him it wasn't public information. Cole waited until she was called to the back by a ringing phone, then leaned over the counter. The delivery ledger lay open beside the register. His fingers were fast. One page flipped, then another. There it was. A scribbled name, M. Grace. Shipping address, a P.O. box that hadn't been used in weeks, followed by a forwarding request to a location farther up the mountain, an old trail address unregistered, the kind of place only known by those who'd already been there. Cole didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just left. Walter had opened the tin box that morning. He had waited, unsure why, unsure what he feared. But now, in the soft gray light of mid-morning, with Ranger pacing and the baby asleep in the basket beside the hearth, he had sat down with the box on his lap and peeled back the lid. Inside were 3 things: a folded hospital birth certificate, a handwritten note on the back of a grocery receipt, and a silver chain holding a small charm, the shape of a sunflower, worn smooth by time. The birth certificate was wrinkled but readable. Name, Amelia Grace Harper. Mother, Marissa Grace. No father listed. Born, Portland General Hospital. The note, written in a narrow rush script, said only, "If anything happens, and you find this, her father can't have her. Please, don't let him find her. No signature, no explanations." Walter held the chain in his hand for a long time. Then he folded everything back into the box and returned it to its place in the basket. He looked over at the child Amelia, now not just the baby, and exhaled. That evening, while Walter boiled barley for supper, Ranger froze mid-step and turned toward the window. A low growl rolled in his chest, not the bark of excitement or warning, but something deeper, older. Walter stepped over and followed the dog's gaze. There were faint tracks in the snow along the edge of the tree line, new, not there that morning. A man walking carefully. No animal, no snowshoes. Just one set of heavy boots. Walter didn't speak. He moved to the fire, checked Amelia's blanket, added a small log. Then he opened the drawer beneath the sink where a flare gun and an old Army-issued utility knife still rested from seasons past. He tucked the knife into his coat pocket. The flare gun stayed. Ranger was at the door now, rigid, his hackles lifted, one paw slightly raised, When the knock came, two slow, deliberate raps. The dog erupted, a sound like thunder from a body made of wire and muscle, not a greeting, a memory flaring. Walter opened the door a crack. Cole stood there, coat wet at the hem, face mottled from windburn. He looked older up close. Not old, but worn in a way that felt dangerous. His smile, when it came, didn't touch his eyes. "Sorry to drop in," he said. "Truck slid into a ditch. Thought I saw smoke from your chimney. Mind if I warm up?" Walter said nothing. Ranger's bark deepened. Cole glanced down. A flicker crossed his face. Recognition, then calculation. Walter didn't open the door further. His voice came out low. "Not a good time." "Sure," Cole replied. "Just thought maybe you'd seen a woman pass through here couple days back with a baby and that dog." Walter stared. Cole smiled again. It cracked but didn't break. Ranger's body pressed against the frame like a dam about to give. Walter reached behind the door. Slowly, without comment, he lifted the flare gun. Cole stepped back, eyes narrowing. "All right," he muttered, "just asking." Then he turned, walking back toward the trees, his steps slow but not unsure. That night, Walter blocked the door with a chair. He didn't sleep. Ranger didn't either. Every twig snap outside made the dog growl under his breath. Walter sat in the rocker, the tin box on the table beside him, and one hand resting on the floor near the child. She stirred once, a small whimper in her throat. Walter leaned closer, brushed her cheek with the back of one finger. Then, quietly, almost without meaning to, he whispered, "My girl." Earlier that day, Walter had tested the old radio transmitter tucked in a drawer by the stove, just in case. The battery was spotty at best, crackling with static each time he clicked it on, but he figured a weak signal was better than none. He left it beside the firewood, where it could be reached fast if need ever came. The wind picked up after midnight, scattering loose snow from the trees in muffled bursts against the cabin windows. Inside, the fire had sunk into a glowing bed of coals. Walter hadn't slept. He sat in the rocker, the flare gun still within arm's reach, one hand resting loosely near the base of the basket, where Amelia now slept soundly, her tiny chest rising and falling beneath a knitted blanket that had once belonged to someone else's winter. Ranger lay beside the hearth, eyes half closed but body taut, as if even sleep had to pass through the gate of his vigilance. The dog had barely touched his food since Cole's visit, pacing the door and window frames, pressing his nose to the seams where cold air whispered through. Walter had tried to ease the tension with quiet words, with gentle hands, but Ranger would not relax. He was listening for something, and he heard it before Walter did. A soft click too, precise to be wind, too near to be animal. The back door, not the front. Walter turned, instinct humming back through decades of training. He moved slowly, rising without sound. Amelia stirred in her basket, a small noise in her throat. Ranger rose with him, already moving toward the rear of the cabin. The door swung inward. Cole stood framed in the threshold, soaked in shadow, a flashlight gripped in one hand and a hunting knife in the other. His face was drawn, no longer smirking, jaw tight and unshaven. The cold had colored his cheeks in blotches, but his eyes were alert, angry, hungry. He moved too fast for an old man to react with strength, only with memory. Walter tried to raise his arm, but Cole was already on him, shoving hard, sending the flare gun clattering beneath the table. The knife caught fabric at Walter's side, but didn't cut deep. They hit the floor in a dull thud of limbs and wool and breath. Ranger roared. It wasn't a bark or a growl, but a deep, violent sound from the chest of something once trained to protect, to defend, to end. The dog launched across the room, teeth flashing, claws scraping over floorboards. Cole turned, surprised by the force, and tried to shield himself with his arm. It wasn't enough. Ranger collided with him mid-center, jaws locking onto the padded coat, dragging him backward with a raw, tearing fury. The flashlight spun across the room. The knife skidded under the table. Walter scrambled upright, bleeding from the side, gasping. He shouted something. He didn't remember what, and crawled for the transmitter. The little black box was still where he had left it, beside the logs. He slapped the switch, then pressed the worn rubber button and prayed. Ranger and Cole struggled. The dog had latched onto the man's arm now, snarling, relentless. But Cole fought back, swinging hard with his elbow, landing a blow that sent Ranger tumbling sideways. The dog hit the ground with a pained yelp, favoring his left leg now, blood trailing onto the wooden floor. But he rose again. He limped slow, deliberate back toward the basket. Amelia hadn't cried. She hadn't screamed. Somehow, in the haze of violence, she had remained asleep. Perhaps it was exhaustion or some strange mercy that shielded her from the chaos. Her breath remained steady, her fingers curled around the knit blanket. Cole turned again toward Walter, his jacket torn and face scratched. He stumbled, disoriented. At the window, red and blue lights flickered against the frost. Someone had heard the signal. The door burst open with a crash. Snow followed. 2 officers, weapons drawn, voices firm and unmistakable. One was Deputy Miles, tall and pale-skinned, with broad shoulders and a steady stance. The other, a woman in her late 30s, Sarah Lindholm, small-framed but sharp-eyed, her hair pulled back in a tight bun under her wool cap. Sarah had a reputation in Everbrook for doing the job with methodical precision and zero tolerance for nonsense. Her older brother had disappeared during a domestic abuse call when she was 16. Since then, Sarah didn't hesitate around violent men. Cole lunged for the knife. He didn't make it. The butt of Sarah's radio met his temple with surgical finality. Cole dropped to his knees, groaning. Miles disarmed him, while Sarah cuffed him in one practiced motion. They hauled him upright. Cole spat blood onto the floor, still defiant, but his limbs sagged under the weight of it all. Walter leaned heavily against the counter, blood soaking his shirt. "The baby," he muttered. "We've got her," Sarah said. They checked the child, confirmed she was unharmed. Miles stepped into the back room, returning moments later with Cole's dropped pack. He placed it on the table, unzipped it slowly, revealing a sealed folder inside. Sarah flipped it, opened documents. A photo of Marissa Grace marked with ink, a draft of a DNA test with Cole's name, and several letters, some angry, one dated weeks ago. It was more than enough. Sarah looked at Walter. "We'll have a trauma medic up here in 15. Just hang tight." Walter nodded. Ranger had collapsed near the hearth again, breathing shallow, one leg dark with blood. Walter crawled to him, wrapped a towel around the worst of it, pressed firm and whispered, "You did good, boy. You held." Ranger didn't move his head, but his tail thumped once, barely. Walter reached into the basket, pulled Amelia close to his chest, and sat on the floor beside the dog. The fire glowed behind them. Outside, the storm had broken. By the time spring softened the hills of Montana, the snow had melted into memory, the forest stirred awake, green blades pushed through thawed ground, birds returned with shy songs, and the silence that once pressed heavy on Walter's cabin gave way to something quieter, gentler. Time had moved forward, it always did. But this time, it had not passed alone. Ranger's leg had healed slowly. The scar along his flank remained, a pink line just beneath his fur, but he no longer limped. His steps were steady now, deliberate as ever. 3 months had passed since that winter night, and the dog's days had reshaped around the new rhythm of things. Amelia's laughter echoing through the porch beams, Walter's careful hands brushing dust from forgotten books, and sometimes, though, not often visitors from town, bringing canned peaches and fresh socks and stories he hadn't asked for. Amelia had grown, not much in size, but in brightness. Her eyes tracked movement now, followed the dance of dust motes and sunbeams. She reached for Ranger with tiny hands, and he allowed it, nuzzling her gently, sitting firm whenever she tried to stand. She giggled when he sneezed. She giggled a lot. Walter, for his part, had filled out again, if only a little. The sharp edges of grief had dulled. He shaved every few days now, talked more. He had begun the paperwork in February, slowly, methodically filling out forms at the county office with his old reading glasses slipping down his nose. At the courthouse, when asked why he wanted to adopt the girl, he answered simply, "Because she and that dog brought me back from a life no one was waiting on." No one argued. The official approval arrived in a yellow envelope on the first truly warm morning of April. Walter held it for a long time before opening it. When he did, he said nothing, only set it on the table and poured himself a cup of coffee that tasted somehow like beginning again. Ranger's training had resumed too. Sarah Lindholm, off-duty but determined, had brought up old manuals and quietly offered to help. She knew what therapy dogs meant to kids in foster care, and what they could do for veterans like the ones Walter used to know. Walter hesitated, but eventually agreed. Twice a week, Ranger practiced with Amelia beside him, learning again how to wait, to approach gently, to comfort without a word. He was a natural. He always had been. Walter wrote her name on the cabin door one morning, Amelia Grace Bishop in charcoal, just beneath the frame. The girl laughed when he did it, though she didn't know why. Maybe she just liked the way the letters looked. Ranger stood beside her, tail wagging once. But time, even when kind, doesn't stop. Walter fell ill in early May. A chest infection, then something deeper. The doctor came up once, frowned, and came up again with someone from the VA. They left quietly. Walter didn't say much after that, only that he'd had a good run and that it was easier to go when something worth staying had already begun. He passed on a Thursday. Ranger didn't leave his side. Neither did Amelia, who curled up in the crook of his arm and fell asleep the way she always had. There were no machines, no hospital walls, just firelight, just spring. The funeral happened 2 days later. They held it near the cabin, under the trees. The ones who came brought pieces of him in small gestures. Pamela brought a bouquet of wild asters. Walter once told her they reminded him of his wife. Lily didn't speak. She just stood at the threshold, hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from. Isaiah, the hardware store clerk, wore Walter's old scarf, said nothing, but left a folded note on the step. The 2 firefighters who'd once served with Walter laid their helmets side by side in silence, like men saluting a fallen brother. Helen from the library wiped her eyes and left a copy of To Build a Fire, Walter's favorite Jack London story, dog and all. And Benji, the teenager Walter had once called Kid, stood quietly near the hearth, shoulders hunched under a borrowed suit too big for him. Amelia watched everyone with the calm stillness only babies have. She didn't cry. Ranger stayed close beside her, unmoving. Later that afternoon, after the others had gone, Benji remained. He sat quietly by the hearth, hands folded in his lap. Ranger limped toward him, not urgently, not cautiously, but like he already knew. He rested his head gently on Benji's knee. The boy froze, then slowly placed a hand on the dog's neck. No words passed between them. But something shifted, something settled. Sarah stood by the door, watching. She said nothing. Before leaving, Benji gently tucked the tin box into his backpack. He didn't know why, only that it felt right. Ranger sniffed it once, then looked up as if saying, "Keep it safe." They left the cabin that evening, Benji, Ranger, and the girl. They didn't speak on the way down the hill. The sky was golden, threaded with pink. At the base of the old pine, the wicker basket rested, its blanket still folded, its small charm catching the last slant of sun. And for a moment, it felt as if everything broken had been gathered into something whole again. In a quiet cabin, an old man, a child, and a broken dog found healing, not through noise, but through boundless love. Maybe that's how God works most days, in small moments, in second chances, in love that stays. If you believe that kind of miracle still happens, type Amen in the comments, share this story, and don't forget to subscribe. May God bless everyone watching.